Hey everybody, welcome back to another video on my channel, and today we talk about performance again. Finally, I know, but not about runtime performance, but build time performance. So let's see what Nuxt 3.10 gave us here and what it's good for. Let's have a look. As just mentioned, the opener Nuxt 3.10 is out for a few days, maybe when you watch it for quite a while and it's already Nuxt 4 time, who knows. But with Nuxt 3.10, there are quite some cool functionality coming in that minor version. The thing is, we will have a look at something that's very special and was kind of possible in userland before, but with a bit of more effort. It's a feature called sharedPrerenderData. And Daniel Rowe wrote a blog post about his implementation before the feature actually landed in core, which is linked in the description below if you're interested in that. But first of all, what is it doing? When does it help us? Well, if you have a content-heavy site and you want to pre-render it, or even parts of it, it can already benefit you, because no matter if you use Nuxt content, maybe with Nuxt Studio, or like another headless CMS, or just have a very content-heavy site with, I don't know, lots of JSON data. Whatever you manage, right? That's up to you. And then you want to pre-render it. Then maybe you have some information like, say, the navigation structure stored in that CMS before, and you have to fetch it again and again for each page you pre-render, which means it will take way longer to pre-render all that stuff. And that's not really necessary, right? If some of you remember in Nuxt 2, there was a way to provide that payload data through the Nuxt config. And sharedPrerenderData, which is experimental by the way still, kind of does the same, but you don't have to do a lot. It actually works behind the scenes automatically, and we will have a look how that actually works. But first, let's jump into a demo application, have a look how the time savings actually look like, and then we get into the PR and all the technical details and have a look how it works in the back. The demo application is once again very simply built. We have our Nuxt config, which is empty for now. Then we have our app.view, which fetches some data, and we'll have a look in a bit where, because we define these API points our own, and has like a very basic header, which could be an own component, but for the sake of simplicity, it's not, and uses the Nuxt page here to display some pages. So let's check out the pages we have. We have the index page, which is just saying index, and we go to users, it's fine. And on the user overview page, we have a whopping 1,000 users to render here. No worries, of course, you wouldn't do it like that in an actual application, would have pagination and all that, but once again, for simplicity, we have 1,000 pages here. And then on ID, we fetch for each user, makes sense, some data, right? And then we display the name. And now we want to see how and what kind of data it is. So let's take a look at the server endpoint. And here we have the header file. Very important to actually mimic an actual API call. I give a little delay by 1 second. Might be too much for your API, but yeah, just ballpark figures, right? And then returning the title here. And then in users, we have that ID endpoint, also defined in the server folder and Nitro. And here we get the ID. Once again, we have a 1 second delay and then return some data. Also, very important, if you have no idea what Nitro is, there is a video talked about Nuxt and Nitro before, and we will have a look at all the cool Nitro features in future videos. Just a little bit more time, no worries. But now, what is the whole thing going to do here? Well, we want to pre-render all of that. So right now, this is running in dev and it should work fine. So let's have a look at it first, and then I'll show you how the pre-rendering works like. Okay, let's jump into the browser first and take a look. Let's zoom in a little bit, and it's exactly as I described. We have some header here, having the data. It's all server rendered. It's also very important. We can go to the user overview or click over here, it doesn't matter. And then we can go to some user. That might take a little bit. And then we get John Doe 4. If we go to another user, it's John Doe 29. Okay, nothing crazy so far, right? So let's head back into the code, or especially in the terminal, and let's pre-render all of that and have a look. Oh yeah, before we pre-render, maybe some of you caught eyes on this patches folder here. And yeah, I patched NitroPack a little bit, but the idea is just to show how long the actual generation time took. Maybe it's a good idea to send a PR for that. Well, you know what? I'll be right back.
A few moments later.
Okay, now back to pre-rendering the application. And the whole idea is that we run pnpm generate here, and it will pre-render all the pages the Nitro caller can find. So start with index and users and then go through all the 1000 pages as we see here. And interestingly, you can also notice that each of these pages takes around 2000 milliseconds, so 2 seconds and a bit of overhead to render. Also, they come in batches. That's why like, oh, there's a few, then there's a few. So it is not 1000 times 2 seconds, but there's some batches. So we're done in roughly 25 seconds. For 1000 pages, not that bad actually, but the main point here is that we add up the 1 second from the header call and the 1 second from the user call. But that's very unnecessary actually, because the header information will stay the same all the time, right? There is no need to refetch it again and again and again, but because each pre-rendered page, while pre-rendering, doesn't know about each other in the data, that's how it is. So with the new feature, we can change that. And we can ensure that if you want to access the header data and they've been fetched before, we can just reuse them. And in this case, we'll cut the time in roughly half. In your applications, it depends a bit, of course, how much shared data you have, how much data you have to fetch individually, but you will see some time improvements. I've already implemented it in certain client projects, and well, especially for bigger sites, it really makes a difference. So let's implement it and, well, let's just generate it again and see what happens. First, we have to enable a feature in our Nuxt config. So we just write experimental here and then use the sharedPrerenderData key and set it to true. That's all you have to do. One important thing though, this is very important to mention. Please don't forget to set unique keys for the data you fetch. It's very important that if you have some use fetch or use async data that's, for example, depending on the route slug, that the route slug, or if it's also depending on the locale, is part of the key. Otherwise, this experimental feature might cause problems. Why? Because it relies on the key to ensure that the data is actually there. But if you don't set the key correctly, it could potentially say, oh, the data is there already because it's not known that the route slug is part of the key because you didn't set it. So by accident, you could actually stop fetching data that you want to fetch. So as I mentioned in my use state video from last time, don't forget to set your keys right. It's very important. But yeah, back to generation and see how fast it will be. And when pre-rendering now, we'll see that the build process goes as normal, but now, after initializing the pre-rendering, we see that, oh, okay, the users pages, they only take 1 second now and a bit of overhead, of course, for API calls and caching, but we save 1 second per batch, so to say, per batch of generated sites. And why is that? Well, because the header data is cached. But here we see it's a mere 13.3 something seconds now to pre-render, which is a pretty good result. As I said, your mileage may vary depending on how many shared data you have, right? If it's some settings, some header, footer data, navigation, and so on, this can greatly benefit. But there's one important thing to mention, and you should not forget this. Please always make sure when you use async data to set the correct key. When you use useFetch, it's usually fine. UseFetch will figure it out based on the URL called and based on the params you give it in. That's okay. But when you use async data, for example, with Nuxt content and query content, please make sure you set the correct key, because otherwise it could happen that you accidentally fetched no data at all because, well, if you don't set a key, but the data is depending, let's say, on a route slug, then how should Nuxt know if you don't set a key? Then it would just say, oh, the data is there already. I don't have anything to compute there, and we'll skip over, and that's not what you want. So make sure your key is set. But before jumping into our summary, because now you know the feature, let's have a look at the technical details and how it is implemented in Nuxt.js itself by taking a look at the PR. The PR, which is also linked in the description below, contains the whole implementation. And we'll have a look at a few important parts here. The documentation is also available to read, so feel free to have a look at that. And we jump straight away to the async data composable file. That also applies to useFetch because async data is used under the hood. So yeah, we skip over a few formatting things here and there. And now the interesting part comes down here, which is also nicely commented. So thanks for that, Daniel. The handler will be set. And if it's happening on client side, or if it's not pre-rendering, or if there's for whatever reason no pre-render cache, we use the normal handler that was defined above here. But otherwise, there's a little wrapper function here around the actual handler function because we want to check if the value is already in the shared pre-render cache. So we get the cache. If there's a value, we return it. And otherwise, of course, we run the promise as usual and then set the whole thing in the cache. So far, so good. Also, this only happens on the server side, and that's why the cache is accessible. Right? On the client side, the cache wouldn't really help here to share things across pre-render pages. Then we have a few types here, sure. And this entry here ensures that the whole Nuxt application knows if the shared data option is enabled or not, same as for any experimental option. But we haven't taken a look at the cache yet, and this is what we'll do now. So let's check out the cache implementation, which happens here in the Nitro renderer. And it's very interesting because, first of all, the shared pre-render promises here, of course, it's all only enabled when pre-rendering is active and also when the feature is in. So these are kept track in a map, of course, and then we have the cache here. And the best part is we use unstorage by using this use storage option here. If you haven't heard of unstorage yet, this will also be covered in a future video, but it's a super nice library for, well, storage of any kind, and it's used for caching under the hood on various places in Nuxt and Nitro. And we define a getter and a setter method here, both using use storage to either get the item from a key or eventually set it. And of course, eventually, that's very important, we should free up the memory after the promise resolved, so we can remove it from the map, which is amazing. And then we also make sure that this works with server components or island components. It's also important. And yeah, then we document the option and we're good to go. So the TLDR is really, we set up a cache through unstorage, and we tell async data to check the cache if it is on the server side and during pre-rendering and the experimental option is enabled. And that brings us to the conclusion. If you, as I said before, remember from Nuxt 2 back in time, the good old payload option, this is way better, right? I mean, you don't have to do anything, you just have to enable it and make sure that you use the correct key. And then it would just happen automatically, performance improvements for free for you if you pre-render your page or parts of your pages, of course. That also works. If you do it through route rules, same idea. And that's it for today. I hope you will use this feature. Let me know if that's interesting and if I should cover any other features. I got lots of suggestions already on your list, but I'll make sure I'll bring these on too. Well, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time and happy hacking.